Familiar was bare-armed and in slippers. At 48 there was only a faint powdering of gray in his dark hair, and not a gray thread in his clipped mustache. The old merry widower himself, Allan thought, grinning as he remembered the white-haired but still vigorous man from whom he'd parted at the outbreak of the war. "Morning, Dad," he greeted. "Morning, son. You're up early. Going to Sunday school?" Now, there was the advantage of a father who'd cut his first intellectual tooth on Tom Paine and Bob Ingersoll. Attendance at divine services was on a strictly voluntary basis. "Why, I don't think so. I want to do some reading this morning." "That's always a good thing to do," Blake Hartley approved. "After breakfast, suppose you take a walk down to the station and get me a Times." He dug in his trouser pocket and came out with a $50. "Get anything you want for yourself while you're at it." Allan thanked his father and pocketed the coin. "Mrs. Stauber'll be at Mass," he suggested. "Say, I get the paper now. Breakfast won't be ready till she gets here." "Good idea," Blake Hartley nodded. "Please. You'll have 3/4 of an hour at least." So far, he congratulated himself, everything had gone smoothly. Finishing his toilet, he went downstairs and on to the street, turning left at Brandon to Campbell, and left again in the direction of the station. Before he reached the underpass, a dozen half-forgotten memories had revived. Here was a house that would, in a few years, be gutted by fire. Here were 4 dwellings standing where he had last seen a 5-story apartment building. A gasoline station and a weed-grown lot would shortly be replaced by a supermarket. The environs of the station itself were a complete puzzle to him, until he oriented himself. He bought a New York Times, glancing first of all at the date line. Sunday, August 5th, 1945. He'd estimated pretty closely. The Battle of Okinawa had been won. The Potsdam Conference had just ended. There were still pictures of the B-25 crash against the Empire State Building a week ago Saturday. And Japan was still being pounded by bombs from the air and shells from offshore naval guns. Why, tomorrow, Hiroshima was due for the big job. It amused him to reflect that he was probably the only person in Williamsport who knew that. On the way home, a boy, sitting on the top step of the front porch, hailed him. Allan replied cordially, trying to remember who it was. Of course, Larry Morton! He and Allan had been buddies. They probably had been swimming or playing commandos and Germans the afternoon before. Larry had gone to Cornell the same year that Allan had gone to Penn State. They had both graduated in 1954. Larry had gotten into some government bureau, and then he had married a Pittsburgh girl and had become 12th vice president of her father's firm. He had been killed in 1968 in a plane crash. "You going to Sunday school?" Larry asked, mercifully unaware of the fate Allan foresaw for him. "Why, no. I have some things I want to do at home." He'd have to watch himself. Larry would spot a difference quicker than any adult. "Heck with it," he added. "Golly, I wisht I could stay home from Sunday school whenever I wanted to," Larry envied. "How about us going swimming at the canoe club, 'safter?" Allan thought fast. "Gee, I wisht could," he replied, lowering his grammatical sights. "I gotta stay home, 'safter. We're expecting company, couple of aunts of mine. Dad wants me to stay home when they come." That went over all right. Anybody knew that there was no rational accounting for the vagaries of the adult mind, and no appeal from adult demands. The prospect of company at the Hartley home would keep Larry away, that afternoon. He showed his disappointment. "Ah, jeepers creepers!" he blasphemed euphemistically. "Maybe tomorrow," Allan said, "if I can make it. I gotta go now. Ain't had breakfast yet." He scuffed his feet boyishly, exchanged so longs with his friend, and continued homeward. As he had hoped, the Sunday paper kept his father occupied at breakfast, to the exclusion of any dangerous table talk. Blake Hartley was still deep in the financial section when Allan left the table and went to the library. There should be 2 books there to which he wanted badly to refer. For a while he was afraid that his father had not acquired them prior to 1945, but he finally found them, and carried them on to the front porch, along with a pencil and a ruled yellow scratch pad. In his experienced future, or his past to come, Allan Hartley had been accustomed to doing his thinking with a pencil. As reporter, as novelist plotting his work, as amateur chemist in his home laboratory, as scientific warfare research officer, his ideas had always been clarified by making notes. He pushed a chair to the table and built up the seat with cushions, wondering how soon he would become used to the proportional disparity between himself and the furniture. As he opened the books and took his pencil in his hand, there was one thing missing. If he could only smoke a pipe now! His father came out and stretched in a wicker chair with the Times book review section. The morning hours passed. Allan Hartley leafed through one book and then the other. His pencil moved rapidly at times. At others he doodled absently. There was no question any more in his mind as to what or who he was. He was Allan Hartley, a man of 43, marooned in his own 13-year-old body, 30 years back in his own past. That was, of course, against all common sense, but he was easily able to ignore that objection. He had been made before, against the astronomy of Copernicus, and the geography of Columbus, and the biology of Darwin, and the industrial technology of Samuel Colt, and the military doctrines of Charles de Gaulle. Today's common sense had a habit of turning into tomorrow's utter nonsense. What he needed, right now, but bad, was a theory that would explain what had happened to him. Understanding was beginning to dawn when Mrs. Stauber came out to announce midday dinner. "I hope you won't mind having it so early," she apologized. "Mein sister, Jenny, offer in Nippenose. She is sick. I want to go see her this afternoon. Yet I'll be back in plenty time to get supper, Mr. Hartley." "Hey, Dad," Allan spoke up. "Why can't we get our own supper, and have a picnic like? That'd be fun, and Mrs. Stauber could stay as long as she wanted to." His father looked at him. Such consideration for others was a most gratifying deviation from the juvenile norm, dawn of altruism or something. He gave hearty assent. "Why, of course, Mrs. Stauber. Allan and I can shift for ourselves this evening. Can't we, Allan? You needn't come back till tomorrow morning." "Ach, thank you so much, Mr. Hartley." At dinner, Allan got out from under the burden of conversation by questioning his father about the war and luring him into a lengthy dissertation on the difficulties of the forthcoming invasion of Japan. In view of what he remembered of the next 24 hours, Allan was secretly amused. His father was sure that the war would run on to mid-1946. After dinner they returned to the porch, Hartley père smoking a cigar and carrying out several law books. He only glanced at these occasionally. For the most part he sat and blew smoke rings, and watched them float away. Some thrice guilty felon was about to be triumphantly acquitted by a weeping jury. Allan could recognize a courtroom masterpiece in the process of incubation. It was several hours later that the crunch of feet on the walk caused father and son to look up simultaneously. The approaching visitor was a tall man in a rumpled black suit. He had knobby wrists and big, awkward hands, black hair flecked with gray, and a harsh, bigoted face. Allan remembered him. Frank Gutchall. Lived on Campbell Street. A religious fanatic, and some sort of lay preacher. Maybe he needed legal advice. Allan could vaguely remember some incident. "Good afternoon, Mr. Gutchall. Lovely day, isn't it?" Blake Hartley said. Gutchall cleared his throat. "Mr. Hartley, I wonder if you could lend me a gun and some bullets," he began, embarrassedly. "My little dog's been hurt, and it's suffering something terrible. I want a gun to put the poor thing out of its pain." "Why, yes, of course. How would a 20-gauge shotgun do?" Blake Hartley asked. "You wouldn't want anything heavy." Gutchall fidgeted. "Why, I was hoping you'd let me have a little gun." He held his hands about 6 inches apart. "A pistol that I could put in my pocket. It wouldn't look right to carry a hunting gun on the Lord's Day. People wouldn't understand that it was for a work of mercy." The lawyer nodded. In view of Gutchall's